August 1977, Fannin County, Georgia. The air was not air. It was a weight. A blanket of heat and humidity and the resinous scent of pine, so thick you could feel it on your skin. A damp and sticky presence that clung to clothes and hair and settled deep in the lungs. It was the kind of summer that bleached the color from the sky, leaving a pale, hazy dome over the rolling Appalachian foothills. It was the kind of summer that made the cicadas sing a frantic, buzzing hymn from dawn until dusk, a sound that was the very frequency of heat itself. The dust on the gravel roads was fine as talcum, kicked up by any passing truck into a lingering cloud of red clay that coated the leaves of the kudzu and the Queen Anne's lace lining the ditches. Down in the valleys, the creeks ran slow and low, their water the color of weak tea, slipping over smooth, mossy stones. On the ridges, the oaks and hickories stood motionless, their leaves drooping in the oppressive stillness. This was a place that measured time in seasons, not days. A place where the rhythm of life was governed by the planting and the harvest, by the first frost and the last. And in the summer of 1977, it was a place watching a story unfold, a quiet drama of ash and iron and a woman named Eleanor Vance. Eleanor Vance was 64 years old, a new widow. She had buried her husband, Thomas, in the spring, when the dogwoods were still in bloom, their white and pink blossoms a stark and beautiful contrast to the raw, red earth of the churchyard plot. The fire had come 2 months later, in the dead of a July night. A lightning strike, the fire marshal had said. A stray bolt from a dry thunderstorm that had rattled the windows, but dropped no rain. It found the old farmhouse's knob and tube wiring, a system as old as the house itself, and the dry, heart pine timbers did the rest. The volunteer fire department from Blue Ridge did what they could, their tanker trucks laboring up the steep gravel drive, but by the time they got the pumps going, the house was already a skeleton, a roaring pyre against the blackness of the mountain night. They saved the chimney, a tall, proud stack of fieldstone Thomas had built himself, and they kept the flames from spreading to the big oak tree in the yard. But the house, the repository of 40 years of a shared life, was gone. What remained was a ruin, a charcoal-blackened foundation filled with a jumble of burned timbers, twisted metal roofing, and the sad, skeletal remains of furniture. The smell of wet ash and creosote hung in the heavy air for weeks, a constant, acrid reminder. The insurance adjuster came, a man in a clean shirt and tie that seemed out of place in the rural quiet. He walked the perimeter, made notes on a clipboard, and shook his head with practiced sympathy. The policy was old, the coverage minimal. It would pay for the demolition, he explained. It would pay to have the debris hauled away. It would leave Eleanor with a clean, empty plot of land and a few $1,000s, enough for a deposit on a small apartment in town. That was the sensible path, the only path. The men of the county had one word for it: grief. It was the only explanation that made sense. Grief, they said, could make a person do strange things. It could cloud judgment, make the sensible seem impossible, and the impossible seem necessary. They saw her car, a dusty Ford Falcon, parked by the side of the drive day after day. They saw her walking through the wreckage, a small, determined figure in a simple cotton dress and sturdy work boots. She wasn't crying. She wasn't wringing her hands. She was working, sifting, moving blackened debris from one pile to another with a quiet, methodical purpose that was more unsettling than any display of sorrow. Then came the crane. It was not a large crane, not the kind used for building highways or office buildings. It was a Pettibone Model 25 rough-terrain crane, a compact four-wheeled machine painted a faded construction site yellow. It arrived on a Tuesday morning, chugging its way up the drive, its diesel engine a low growl that disturbed the morning peace. It was followed by a flatbed truck, a 1968 Ford F600 with a long, weathered wooden bed, driven by a man with a sunburnt neck. Two other men, lean and wiry, rode with him. Eleanor Vance had hired them herself, a direct transaction that bypassed any contractor or foreman. She paid them in cash. The cost was specific. The crane rental from a small outfit over in Ellijay was $75 an hour, a 4-hour minimum, $300. The flatbed truck was $150 for the trip. The two laborers, the brothers Jimmy and Ray Satterfield, were paid $50 apiece for what they were told would be a half-day's work, a total of $550. This was a significant sum in 1977, especially for a woman in her position. It was a substantial portion of the first insurance check. It was money that could have paid for 3 months' rent. It was money for groceries, for gasoline, for the small necessities of starting a new life. Instead, it was spent on a single, counterintuitive act. Eleanor did not direct the men to clear the foundation. She did not ask them to lift the heavy, fallen beams or the twisted sheets of roofing. She led the crane operator, a man named Carl, to one specific corner of the ruin. The corner where the kitchen had been. Amidst the rubble of charred cabinets and melted linoleum, a single object stood, tilted but largely intact. A massive cast-iron wood-burning cook stove. It was a beast of a thing, a home comfort model from the 1920s, but not entirely. Thomas had modified it heavily over the years. It was soot-blackened, its nickel plating bubbled and peeled away by the intense heat. One of its cast-iron legs had melted into a stub, causing it to list like a sinking ship. To any observer, it was a ruined artifact, a piece of scrap metal whose only value lay in its weight. Her instructions were precise. She wanted the stove, and only the stove, lifted from the wreckage. The men exchanged glances. They had been told the job was unusual. They had not been told it was nonsensical. Carl, the crane operator, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. He looked at Eleanor, then at the stove, then back at Eleanor. He had cleared dozens of burned houses in his time. The process was always the same. Knock down what was left standing, scoop it all into a dumpster, and haul it away. This was different. This felt less like demolition and more like a strange, solemn ceremony. But he was being paid, so he climbed into the cab of the Pettibone, fired up the hydraulics, and extended the boom. The Satterfield brothers, using heavy crowbars, cleared a space around the stove. They wrapped thick, greasy chains around its body, the metal links clanking loudly in the quiet morning. They argued for a moment about the best place to attach the hooks, worrying that the heat-damaged iron might crack under the strain. Eleanor watched, her face unreadable, her arms crossed over her chest. She pointed to the solid support frame underneath, a detail they had missed. They readjusted the chains. The crane's engine whined as it took the strain. The chains went taut, groaning with the immense weight. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sucking sound of release from the ash-covered floor, the stove lifted. It rose slowly, swinging gently in the air, a black pendulum against the pale sky. It dripped sooty water. It shed flakes of rust and burned paint. It looked like a relic from a forgotten age, a strange, wounded creature being airlifted from its lair. Carl carefully swung the boom over and lowered the stove onto the flatbed truck. It landed with a deafening clang that echoed off the trees. But the job was not done. Eleanor directed the Satterfield brothers back to the foundation, to the exact spot where the stove had stood. There, embedded in the concrete of the kitchen floor, was a square of raised metal, about 2 feet by 2 feet, with a handle set flush with its surface. It was a small trapdoor, an access panel Thomas had built into the floor. It was something no one but he and Eleanor knew existed. The fire had warped it slightly, and it took the combined effort of both brothers with their crowbars to pry it open. Beneath it was not a crawl space. It was a small, tightly sealed compartment, a fireproof safe of Thomas's own design, bolted directly to the foundation. Inside, nestled amongst fire bricks, was a heavy, galvanized steel box. It was warm to the touch, but it had survived. Jimmy Satterfield lifted it out. It was heavy, maybe 40 pounds. He handed it to Eleanor. She took the box without a word. She carried it to her car and placed it carefully on the passenger seat. She then walked back to the men, paid them the agreed-upon amount in crisp $20 bills, and thanked them for their time. The flatbed drivers secured the stove with more chains. The crane operator retracted his boom. Within the hour, they were gone, leaving Eleanor alone again with the ruin, the silence, and the heavy steel box. The news traveled the way news always did in Fannin County. It moved from the truck drivers to the men at the co-op. It was discussed over coffee at the diner in Blue Ridge. It was whispered about in the checkout line at the Piggly Wiggly. It became the topic of conversation in the church parking lot after the Sunday service. The story was simple, and, to everyone who heard it, deeply sad. The widow Vance had spent a small fortune to haul away a worthless, burned-up stove. The chorus of community opinion was unified. It was a chorus of pity, of concern, of a certain kind of gentle, back-porch mockery, reserved for those who had stepped outside the bounds of common sense. They were not malicious. They were practical people, farmers and loggers and small business owners. They understood the value of $1. They understood the hard logic of loss and recovery. And what Eleanor Vance had done defied that logic completely. The land itself had value. The 60 acres of mixed hardwood and pine, with a creek running through the bottomland, was worth something. $20,000, maybe $25,000. A respectable sum. The standing timber alone could be sold for $5,000 or $6,000. The sensible thing, the only thing to do, was to clear the wreckage, sell the land to a developer from Atlanta or a timber company, and use the money to live comfortably. Her attachment to the stove was seen as a dangerous sentimentality, a foolish clinging to a past that was literally in ashes. Old Man Hemphill, who ran the feed store, summed up the general consensus. He leaned on his counter, a bag of chicken feed propped beside him, and spoke to a small group of farmers. He said he had seen it before. He said that when a man dies, he sometimes takes a piece of his wife's mind with him. The others nodded in solemn agreement. It was grief. a profound and disorienting grief. They hoped, for her sake, that it would pass before she wasted the rest of the insurance money. The stove was taken to a small rented garage behind a gas station on the edge of town. It sat there on the concrete floor, a hulking, silent monument to what everyone saw as folly. Eleanor paid $60 a month for that garage. More good money after bad, the chorus murmured. For the next few months, a routine was established. Every morning, Eleanor would drive out to the burned-down farm. She did not hire a demolition crew. Instead, she began the slow, arduous task of clearing the debris herself. She bought a wheelbarrow, a heavy-duty shovel, and a set of leather work gloves. She worked with a tireless, steady pace that belied her age. She separated the blackened wood from the twisted metal. She piled the salvageable field stones from the chimney into neat stacks. She filled the wheelbarrow with ash and dumped it in a pit she had dug at the edge of the woods. The people who drove by saw her there, a solitary figure in the ruin, and they shook their heads. They saw the new calluses forming on her hands. They saw the streaks of soot on her face and clothes. She was dismantling her past piece by piece, but she was not throwing it away. She was sorting it. She was organizing the chaos. In the afternoons, she would go to the rented garage. She would lock the door behind her. No one knew what she did in there. The owner of the gas station said he could sometimes hear the sound of metal scraping against metal, a high-pitched, grating sound. Sometimes he heard hammering, but mostly there was just silence. Inside that garage, the real work was happening. The heavy steel box sat on a workbench, open. Its contents were not what anyone would have imagined. There were no family heirlooms, no hidden cash, no sentimental photographs. There were notebooks, 27 of them. Spiral-bound, dime store notebooks, the kind a student might use. But their pages were filled not with prose, but with the dense, meticulous handwriting of her husband, Thomas Vance. Thomas had been a quiet man, a farmer, a man who was good with his hands. That was the public perception. The reality, known only to Eleanor, was that he had been a genius. A self-taught metallurgist, an inventor, a master craftsman of iron. The notebooks were his life's work. They were filled with chemical formulas, with complex diagrams, with detailed instructions for processes he had invented himself. There were recipes for iron alloys, specifying precise percentages of carbon, silicon, manganese, and phosphorus. He had developed a type of ductile iron that was incredibly strong, yet resistant to the cracking that plagued most cast iron stoves when subjected to repeated, intense heating and cooling. There were detailed, hand-drawn schematics for a cupola furnace, a small backyard foundry capable of melting iron. There were pages upon pages dedicated to the lost wax casting process, an ancient technique he had adapted for creating intricate, one-piece iron components with a flawless finish. The stove was not just a stove, it was his masterpiece, his prototype. He had built it himself, piece by piece, over the course of a decade, casting each part in a small hidden workshop behind the old barn. The firebox was a single, seamless piece, designed with a baffle system that recirculated hot gases, making it extraordinarily efficient. The decorative panels were not just decoration. They were functional heat fins, designed to maximize the surface area for radiating warmth into the room. The stove was a testament to a lifetime of secret, obsessive innovation. The fire had warped it, damaged it, made it ugly, but it had not destroyed its core. And more importantly, the blueprints for its creation, The very mind of its creator had been preserved in the steel box bolted to the floor beneath it. That was what Eleanor had spent $550 to save. Not a piece of scrap metal, but a legacy. A book of secrets written in the language of iron and fire. As autumn came, the air grew crisp and the leaves on the hickories turned a brilliant yellow. The work at the farm changed. With the last of the insurance money, Eleanor had a concrete slab poured where the house had once stood. It was smaller than the original foundation, just 30 by 40 feet. Then a truck arrived with a load of cinder blocks. Another arrived with steel trusses for the roof. She did not hire a crew of masons. She had learned from Thomas. She had watched him build the fieldstone chimney, had mixed the mortar for him, had handed him the stones. Now she did the work herself. She laid the blocks one by one, her movements slow but precise. She used a level and a plumb line. She troweled the mortar with a steady hand. The walls of a new building began to rise from the ashes of the old one. It was not a house. It was a workshop. The men of the county watched this new development with a fresh wave of bewilderment. The theory of grief was beginning to wear thin. This was not the behavior of a woman lost in sorrow. This was the behavior of a woman with a plan, a strange, incomprehensible plan, but a plan nonetheless. They saw the metal roof go up, gleaming in the autumn sun. They saw a heavy-duty electrical line run from the pole down by the road. They saw a tall, insulated smokestack installed through the roof. By the time the first snow fell, the workshop was complete. It was a simple, utilitarian building, stark and windowless on 3 sides. But it was solid. It was hers. She moved the contents of the rented garage into the new space. The wounded stove, the workbench, the box of notebooks, and a collection of tools and equipment she had been quietly acquiring for months. A drill press from a Sears catalog. An arc welder bought at an auction. A heavy anvil and a set of blacksmithing tools she had purchased from the estate of a retired farrier. The winter of 1977 to 78 was a cold one. Snow lay on the ground for weeks at a time. The world of Fannin County settled into a quiet, indoor rhythm. But inside Eleanor Vance's new workshop, a new fire was being kindled. Using Thomas's detailed diagrams, she began to build her own cupola furnace. She welded the steel shell herself, her face shielded by a heavy mask. The bright flashes of the welder illuminating the dark interior of the shop. She lined it with fire bricks, mortaring them into place with a special high-temperature cement whose formula was detailed in notebook number 7. She built the blower system from a salvaged electric motor and a squirrel cage fan. She spent her evenings at a small table under a bare light bulb, studying the notebooks. She was not just reading them. She was memorizing them. She was absorbing the complex chemistry, the physics of heat transfer, the intricate geometry of the casting patterns. She had been her husband's silent apprentice for 40 years. She had watched him work, had listened to his quiet explanations. She had not understood the science then, but she had understood the passion. She had understood the dedication. Now, with the notebooks as her guide, the science began to make sense. Her first goal was to repair the original stove. This was her apprenticeship. She needed to learn to cast iron, to replicate the parts that had been destroyed in the fire. She started with the simplest piece, one of the melted legs. Following Thomas's instructions, she carved a perfect replica of an intact leg out of a block of wood. This was the pattern. She then used the pattern to create a mold from a special mixture of sand, clay, and water. The first pour was a failure. The iron was too cool. It solidified in the channel before it could fill the mold completely. The second attempt was also a failure. The mold was too damp, and the steam created a pockmarked, useless casting. The notebooks had warned of these possibilities. They offered solutions. Adjust the air-to-coke ratio in the furnace. Dry the molds in a low oven for precisely 3 hours. On the third try, it worked. She broke open the cooled sand mold to reveal a perfect, newly cast iron leg. It was still rough, covered in a crust of sand and scale, but the shape was right. The details were crisp. She cleaned it with a wire brush, then ground the rough edges smooth. It was an exact match for the originals. She felt a surge of triumph, a feeling she had not experienced since before Thomas's death. It was more than just a piece of metal. It was a resurrection. It was proof that she could do this. Over the next several months, she replaced every damaged part of the old stove. She cast a new firebox door, a new grate, a new decorative side panel, replicating the intricate scroll work that had been melted into an unrecognizable lump. She reassembled the stove piece by piece, using new gaskets and furnace cement. When it was done, she gave it a fresh coat of high-temperature black paint. It looked magnificent. Not just repaired, but reborn. It stood in the center of her workshop, a powerful black presence, ready for fire. But the stove was just the beginning. It was the school where she had learned the craft. Now she was ready to graduate. The notebooks contained more than just the designs for that one stove. They held drawings for dozens of other items. Andirons with a detailed pine cone motif. A fireplace screen decorated with the silhouettes of deer and oak leaves. Heavy, beautifully balanced fireplace tool sets. Intricate boot scrapers in the shape of a coiled snake. She began to produce these items, one at a time. Her process was slow and laborious. It was a one-woman foundry. She did everything herself. She prepared the sand for the molds. She carved the wooden patterns. She charged the furnace with scrap iron and coke. She managed the dangerous, dramatic pour, guiding the crucible of white-hot liquid metal. She broke the molds, cleaned the castings, and finished each piece by hand. In the fall of 1978, she loaded the back of her Ford Falcon with a small selection of her work and drove to the annual Sorghum Festival in the nearby town of Blairsville. She paid $10 for a small booth between a woman selling canned preserves and a man selling carved wooden bears. Her display was simple: a few sets of andirons, a fireplace screen, and a dozen boot scrapers, all laid out on a simple wooden table. At first, people just walked by. Her work was not colorful. It was not quaint. It was heavy, black, and serious. But then people began to stop. They picked up the items. They felt the weight, the substance. They noticed the incredible detail in the castings, a level of quality they had never seen before. A man who owned a hardware store in Atlanta picked up one of the andirons. He turned it over and over in his hands, marveling at the seamless construction, the flawless finish. He asked her where she got them. She told him she made them. He didn't believe her at first. Then he saw the calluses on her hands and the faint trace of soot under her fingernails. He bought everything she had. He gave her a standing order for more. That was the turning point. The world outside of Fannin County was changing. The energy crisis, sparked by the revolution in Iran, was in full swing. The price of heating oil and natural gas was skyrocketing. People were panicking. They were looking for alternatives. They were turning back to a source of heat their grandparents had relied on: wood. A massive nationwide demand for wood-burning stoves was born overnight. The market was flooded with cheap, hastily manufactured stoves. They were made of thin sheet metal or poor-quality cast iron. They were inefficient. They warped under high heat. Their seams leaked smoke. Stories of cracked fireboxes and house fires became common. Eleanor Vance saw the opportunity. The notebooks contained plans not just for the old cook stove, but for a smaller, more modern heating stove. It was a design Thomas had been working on just before he died. It was a marvel of thermodynamic efficiency. It featured his signature single-piece baffled firebox, a secondary combustion chamber to burn off hot gases, and a precisely calibrated air intake system that allowed for long, slow burns. It was designed to extract the maximum amount of heat from every piece of wood. And it was designed to be safe, built from his proprietary crack-resistant iron alloy. She stopped making andirons and boot scrapers. She dedicated the workshop entirely to producing the new stove. She named it the Vance. She built the first one in the winter of 1979. It was a compact, handsome stove with clean lines and a simple, elegant design. She installed it in her own small rented room in town, replacing the inefficient electric heater. The difference was astonishing. The little stove could heat the